In late 1776, the fortunes of the Patriots fighting the American Revolution were at their nadir. It had been a year of defeat. Washington's main Continental Army had been beaten on Long Island and Manhattan, and forced to retreat across New Jersey with the British horde on his heels. Battle casualties, the surrender of outposts, and desertions had reduced his army from around 19,000 men, before the Battle of New York, to less than 6,000 troops. Another American army, under Benedict Arnold, had been driven from Canada, after failing to capture Quebec the preceding winter. Thomas Paine called the period, "the times which try men's souls." Congress, having done little to support the cause since declaring independence, fled Philadelphia to Baltimore, where they continued to do little. For the British, Washington commanded a defeated army, and if he could not be trapped against the Delaware River separating New Jersey and Pennsylvania, he would be the following spring. But Washington had a weapon the British failed to fully appreciate. It had already rescued his army from entrapment against a water barrier, and it would do so again at the end of 1776, to maximize its value. As Washington reached and crossed the Delaware, he had his men seize all boats and bring them to the Pennsylvania side, where his troops could finally rest. On New Year's Day 1777, the enlistments of most of his demoralized men would expire. He first needed to keep his army intact, and then find a way to use it before the revolution ended ignominiously. Here is how Washington faced the greatest crisis of his military career, and turned into his finest hour. Washington lost his second-in-command during the retreat from New York. Major General Charles Lee was a former British officer. He had served in the British Army in North America, Portugal, Poland, and Ireland before migrating to Virginia in 1775. He traveled extensively through the colonies during that pivotal year, ingratiating himself with Patriot leaders. By the time of the disastrous defeat on Long Island, he commanded a wing of the Continental Army, and served as Washington's second-in-command. During the retreat across New Jersey, Lee moved slowly, despite Washington's urgings for him to link up with the main body of the army. Instead, Lee moved at a leisurely pace. At some distance from his troops, he was in a tavern in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, writing a letter criticizing Washington to General Horatio Gates. When he was captured by British cavalry on December 12, 1776, Lee believed that he, rather than Washington, should be in command of the Continental Army, and had written numerous letters complaining of Washington's lack of ability. "A certain great man is most damnably deficient," he wrote in the letter he was composing when he was captured. Washington assigned General John Sullivan to command Lee's former troops, and the new commander followed the orders of his superior with dispatch. Losing Lee proved to be a boon for the Continental Army, and he remained in British custody until 1778. After returning to the Patriot cause that year, he soon demonstrated his penchant for insubordination had not changed. In Sullivan, Washington found an obedient and skilled subordinate, one who would prove vital to the success of Washington's plans for the last days of 1776. Washington had a regiment of mariners with his army. The Continental Army's 14th Regiment was comprised mainly of seamen and fishermen from the environs of Marblehead, Massachusetts. Commanded by Colonel John Glover, a merchant and shipowner, the regiment proved to be among the most valued in Washington's army during 1776. The men were more disciplined than many of his regiments. Accustomed to the need for discipline demanded at sea, they wore leather vests, weathered sea boots, and seamen's caps. After the defeat on Long Island, Washington's troops were trapped on the eastern tip of the island, entrenched but too weak in numbers and equipment to withstand a British siege. His defeat had been total, and it appeared there was no escape. The British Navy controlled the waters around Long Island. Their army blocked all land routes. Washington turned to the Marbleheaders. They responded with what has been described as a military miracle. On the night of August 29 to 30, 1776, the Marblehead Regiment carried the entire Continental Army, from beneath the guns of the British to the relative safety of Manhattan. They carried the men, horses, cannon, wagons, supplies, baggage, and all the other detritus across the East River, through a dense fog which hampered visibility. They accomplished the feat without the loss of a man or a gun, having demonstrated their seamanship. The Marblehead Regiment then served with distinction during the actions on Manhattan, often standing as a rear guard to cover the Americans' retreats. Washington pondered the unique capabilities of the unit. As his battered army limped across New Jersey to the Delaware River, as he neared the river, he dispatched the Marblehead Regiment to gather all boats for miles along its banks. The boats went to the Pennsylvania side with his army. Enlistments threatened the existence of the Continental Army in December. Besides the humiliating defeats endured by the Continentals in 1776, Many other problems plagued George Washington during the retreat through New Jersey. His men had not been paid for months, many had never been paid at all. Food was scarce, what little had been supplied by Congress often proved to be spoiled. Clothes issued earlier in the summer had worn out, especially shoes and boots. Unseasonably cold weather set in during November and continued into December. Congress received Washington's many letters describing the condition of his men, considered them, debated, and did nothing. Having not given themselves the authority to levy taxes, there wasn't much they could do besides beg the states for help. Once Washington's army crossed into Pennsylvania, he paused his retreat. He had two things in his favor: one, the Delaware River was in flood with ice floes hampering navigation; two, it was the custom of the British Army, in fact all European armies, to close down offensive operations during the winter months. Washington also had a well-organized espionage network informing him of British plans and the disposition of troops. The British established a chain of outposts across New Jersey and settled down for the winter. Temporarily safe from further pursuit, Washington turned his attention to convincing his troops to extend their enlistments for an additional 6 weeks. He could promise little besides what the men had already been promised and not received. Yet if he did nothing, he would have no army at all as the new year began. Washington and the crisis. On December 19, Thomas Paine published the first of an eventual 13 essays, which later appeared in a pamphlet entitled The American Crisis. On December 23, 1 week before the enlistments of most of his men were to run out, Washington had the troops mustered. The regiments had the essay read to them, with its references to summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. At the same time, a large contingent of militia gathered below Bordentown, on the other side of the Delaware. It drew the attention of the Hessian and British garrison there, which moved to investigate. The result was a skirmish known as the Battle of Mount Holly. A large party of American militia was driven from the field. The Hessians under Karl von Donop remained where they were following the skirmish, having failed to destroy the enemy force. That meant they were too distant to support the garrison in Trenton. Washington's adjutant, Joseph Reed, was present at the skirmish, having arrived there to discuss a possible diversionary attack on Bordentown the day after Christmas. Washington, as his men prepared to wait out the last weeks of their enlistments, had planned an offensive move against the British and Hessians in New Jersey. Only his most senior and trusted officers were aware of his plans. Washington had hoped for an attack at Bordentown coordinated with one at Trenton, but the premature action at Mount Holly, if it was premature, served his plans just as well. Donop was out of position, unable to provide support to the Trenton garrison under Johann Rall, especially given the deteriorating conditions of the roads. Both Donop and Rall asked British General James Grant, in command in New Jersey, for reinforcements. Their requests went unanswered. Washington needed a victory to restore morale among his troops. In December 1776, George Washington was aware he badly needed a victory. If he was to have any chance of keeping his army together following the end of the year, new levies for recruits in the several states would provide additional help. But he needed to retain a veteran corps for at least a month into the new year. Nothing would boost his chances of succeeding in retaining men than a victory. That is nothing other than money. In yet another letter to Congress, Washington stressed the need to pay his troops. If not all they were owed, at least some of it. Unable to do anything further in the way of money, he turned his attention to obtaining a victory. Despite the tattered, defeated air about his army, he had some advantages. For one thing, the British and Hessians couldn't believe him capable of launching an attack. In their minds, the same flooded and ice-clogged Delaware River, which protected the Americans from attack, offered similar protection to the New Jersey garrisons. The wintry weather was atrocious and getting colder by the day. Loyalist spies in the region kept General Grant apprised of the condition of Washington's army. Yet they failed to inform the British of the concentration of large boats, called Durham boats, gathered on the banks of the river near Washington's encampments, or if they did, the British failed to understand their significance. They learned soon enough. On Christmas Day 1776, Washington mustered 3,000 of his most reliable troops, and marched them to the riverbank. There awaited Glover's Marblehead Regiment, ready to load the troops' horses and artillery aboard and convey them across to New Jersey. The password that night was victory or death. Crossing the Delaware. In the famous painting Washington Crossing the Delaware, painted in 1851, the general stands near the prow of the boat, a cloak around him, gazing determinedly ahead. The painting is certainly a romanticized image of the event. Washington undoubtedly sat, head bent to the wind-driven sleet, as the Marblehead seamen dealt with the dangerous ice floes in the racing river current. Many of the men took with them new blankets, which had providentially arrived on Christmas Eve. Old blankets were cut up and wrapped around the tatters of their footwear. The boats in which they rowed were large, flat-bottomed freight boats, some as much as 60 feet in length, and about 8 feet in beam. They were propelled by pushing poles against the river bottom, and walking the length of the boat. Typically 3 or 4 men served that purpose, others fended off the dangerous ice floes. The temperature dropped as the operation ran on, the wind-driven sleet creating ice-slicked wooden decks. The Marblehead men weren't the only men operating the boats, other men who made their living on the Delaware River joined them. There were 3 crossing points, and the entire command failed to cross the river, including a detachment commanded by Colonel John Cadwalader. General James Ewing was to ferry across and hold the bridge across Assunpink Creek, denying it to the enemy as an escape group. His crossing also failed. John Sullivan commanded the detachment accompanied by Washington and his staff. Although several men received a dunking in the frigid Delaware, none were lost during the crossing, which included 18 pieces of artillery and the horses to drag them. By the time the army was assembled and ready to march on Trenton, the sleet had changed to snow. The march to Trenton was brutal. In the dark, Washington divided his men into 2 columns. One under John Sullivan was assigned a route to Trenton which followed along the river, the other under Nathaniel Greene took another road further inland. Washington traveled with the latter group. The temperature was by then well below freezing, and jagged ice ripped at the legs and feet of the men as they marched. The columns frequently stopped, unable to see ahead. Both columns sent detachments ahead to block anyone leaving Trenton. While on the march, Washington learned that neither Ewing nor Cadwalader had been able to get their men across the river. He also received a message from John Sullivan that his men's gunpowder was wet from the rain, sleet, and snow. Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. Washington said to the messenger, I am resolved to take Trenton. It was obvious the planned pre-dawn attack was impossible, but the troops plodded on as the winter storm continued to worsen. Just as the column neared Trenton, Washington learned a detachment of New Jersey militia, about 50 men led by Adam Stephen, had attacked a Hessian picket outpost. Washington raged at Stephen, who had no knowledge of the pending American attack on Trenton. Washington's concern was that Stephen's freelance attack had alerted the Hessian garrison. He need not have worried. The Hessian commander viewed the attack as a nuisance raid, which in fact was what it was. The Hessian garrison was not alerted and prepared for an assault. When Washington and Sullivan arrived at the town by their separate routes, Washington led the attack himself, riding at the head of his column. Despite being several hours behind schedule, the attack achieved complete surprise. Trenton was a small battle which provided the Americans a major victory. Ewing's failure to cross the Delaware left open the possibility for the Hessians to retreat from the attack via the bridge over Assunpink Creek. When Washington attacked, Hessian units blocking the river road moved to assist the units making a fighting withdrawal before the Americans. Sullivan's column arrived on the river road and used it to fight through the town to seize the bridge, trapping the Hessians between 2 American columns. Washington sent some units to block the Princeton Turnpike, and the last escaped route was closed. The fighting was sharp, some of it house to house, but after American artillery was set up and in action on Trenton's streets, the Hessians were forced to attempt to reform in the fields outside of town. Colonel Rahl fell mortally wounded, though he survived long enough to surrender. He passed later that night. The Hessians lost 22 dead, 83 wounded, and 896 taken prisoner. The Americans had 2 dead and 5 wounded, among them future President James Monroe. American troops captured all of the Hessian stores, including over 1,000 muskets, bayonets, cannon, and badly needed gunpowder. They also captured the Hessians' food stores, tents, shoes and boots, uniform coats and other clothing, and a large supply of rum and beer. Unfortunately, some of the celebrating Americans broke into the latter before Washington had it under guard, leading to several more men falling into the Delaware on the return trip. By midday on December 28, all of the Americans, their prisoners, and the captured supplies were back on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, ferried there by the Marblehead men and their supporters. Washington immediately began planning further operations, while the British reacted in shock. The victory at Trenton saved the Continental Army. Earl Cornwallis had energetically pursued George Washington across New Jersey in the fall of 1776, after seeing his defeated enemy enter Pennsylvania, had returned to New York, where he planned to depart for leave in England. After learning of Trenton, Sir William Howe ordered Cornwallis back in the field. His leave cancelled. Meanwhile, Washington saw an opportunity to use the plunder from Trenton to create further havoc among the garrisons in New Jersey, but he still needed an army. New Year's Day loomed as the day when most of his command's enlistments would come to an end. On December 30, Washington again mustered his forces and asked them to extend their enlistments for another month. He promised a $10 bonus for any man who agreed to stay. Washington had long experience as a military recruiter, dating to his days in the Virginia militia 2 decades earlier. Gradually, under his cajoling and no doubt heartened, when other men of their units stepped forward, most of the men agreed to stay. That same day, Washington moved the army back to Trenton. 2 days later, New Year's Day 1777, Washington received a sum of money from Congress, and the troops received some of what they were owed. The supplies captured from the Hessians made life in the encampments more bearable. Shattered footwear was replaced, and the troops were well supplied with gunpowder and lead. By then, Washington's spies had informed him that Cornwallis was back in New Jersey, in command of about 6,000 veteran troops. With orders to destroy the Continental Army, the American Revolution was still very much alive. But it still badly needed another audacious move by George Washington if it was to survive. Washington prepared for another battle in Trenton in January 1777. In Trenton, supported by Cadwalader, who had finally moved his troops across the Delaware River, Washington fortified a line along Assunpink Creek, where he contemplated his next move, either against the Hessians under Donope or against Cornwallis. The fortifications were mostly busy work for the troops. Washington had already learned from his spies that Cornwallis intended to trap the Continentals in Trenton, leading to their surrender or destruction. He also knew from his farmer's instincts that the weather, which had warmed since Christmas, was about to get colder again.